You know, after all these years, after sitting across from thousands of people who are hurting, angry, or just plain lost, I've learned that the heaviest thing a human being can carry isn't a weight you can see. It isn't a physical burden or a financial debt. It's a secret. It's that one thing you've buried so deep that you've started to believe it isn't there anymore, even though it's the very thing that's steering your life into a ditch. When I first saw Elena sitting in the dressing room on the monitors backstage, I didn't see a woman who was ready to talk. I saw a woman who was braced for impact. She was sitting there, perfectly composed, every hair in place, wearing a suit that probably cost more than some people make in a month, but her hands were folded so tight in her lap that her knuckles were white. She looked like she was trying to hold her entire world together by sheer force of will. And let me tell you, when you see someone working that hard to look okay, you know they are anything but. The title of today's session, at least on the production notes, was about a family dispute over an inheritance and some fractured relationships between a mother and a daughter. But I've been doing this long enough to know that the thing people say they're here for is almost never the real it. It is the thing they're terrified to say out loud. Elena had come to me under the guise of wanting to fix her relationship with her mother, Diane. But as I looked at her through that camera lens before walking out on stage, I saw a woman who was drowning in her own silence. She had this look in her eyes, a look of profound, isolated exhaustion. It's the look people get when they've been lying to themselves for so long that they've forgotten what the truth even sounds like. I told my producers right then that we weren't going to spend much time talking about the money or the will. We were going to go hunting for the it. When I finally walked out and sat down across from her, the air in the studio felt heavy. You could almost taste the tension. Elena gave me a polite, practiced smile. It was the kind of smile people use to keep you at a distance, a social mask that says, "I'm fine, let's keep this professional." But I don't do mask. My job isn't to be your friend or to help you maintain your illusions. My job is to provide you with a dose of reality, even if it tastes like a bitter pill. I started by asking her why she was really there. She went into this rehearsed monologue about her mother's controlling behavior and how the family had been torn apart by her father's passing. She spoke with such precision, such logic, that it felt cold. It was like she was reading a legal brief about her own life. I let her talk for a bit because I wanted to see the payoff she was getting from this narrative. See, everyone has a payoff for their behavior. For Elena, the payoff for being the victim of her mother's control was that she didn't have to look at her own choices. She could stay in the role of the perfect, wronged daughter. But as she spoke, I noticed something. Every time she mentioned her father, her voice didn't crack with sadness, it tightened with anxiety. Most people think grief is a softening emotion, but for some, it's a hardening one. I watched her body language. She would lean away from me, her eyes darting toward the exit signs every few minutes. She was looking for a way out before the conversation even got started. I looked at her and said, "Elena, you're giving me a lot of facts and you're giving me a lot of history, but you aren't giving me any truth. You're talking like a narrator of someone else's story. I want to know about the woman sitting in that chair. I want to know what's keeping you up at 3 o'clock in the morning when the lights are off and there's no one left to impress." She stiffened. The mask slipped just a fraction of an inch. She tried to pivot back to her mother, back to the safe conflict, but I wasn't having it. I've learned that you have to earn the right to help someone, but you also have to be willing to call them on their garbage. And Elena was carrying a mountain of it. I started digging into the backstory. I wanted to understand the herd she came from. You can't understand the individual without understanding the family system that shaped them. Elena grew up in a household where appearance was everything. Her father was a prominent figure in their community, a man who was respected, feared, and idolized. Her mother, Diane, was the gatekeeper of that image. In their house, you didn't have feelings, you had a role to play. If you were hurting, you hid it. If you were failing, you lied about it. It was a factory for high-functioning, broken people. Elena was the star pupil of that school. She had the degrees, the career, the perfect marriage on paper. But as I peeled back the layers of her childhood, I began to see a pattern of extreme isolation. She had been raised to believe that the truth was a liability. She told me about a time when she was 12 years old and had failed a test. Instead of helping her, her mother told her to stay in her room until she could present herself properly to her father. The message was clear. Your value is tied to your performance. If you aren't perfect, you don't exist. That kind of psychological grooming creates a person who is terrified of being known. It creates a person who views a secret not as a burden, but as a survival mechanism. As she talked about her past, her voice started to lose that rehearsed quality. It became smaller. She wasn't the high-powered executive anymore. She was that 12-year-old girl in her room waiting for permission to be seen. But there was still something missing. The math wasn't adding up. The level of anxiety she was displaying didn't match the story of a controlling mother and a cold father. There was a sharper edge to her fear. I've developed a sort of internal radar for when someone is holding back the atomic secret, the one that, if told, changes everything. I could see it in the way she avoided eye contact when I asked about the months leading up to her father's death. She described it as a peaceful passing, but her pupils dilated, and she started picking at the skin around her fingernails. When you see a physiological response like that, you know you've hit a nerve. I decided to shift the focus to her mother, Diane, who was sitting in the backstage area waiting to come out. I asked Elena how she thought her mother would describe their relationship. Elena's entire demeanor changed. She went from vulnerable to defensive in a heartbeat. She started accusing her mother of being a narcissist, of being cruel, of being the reason for every failure in her life. It was a classic case of projection. Now, I'm not saying her mother was a saint. I hadn't met her yet, but Elena was using her mother as a shield. As long as Diane was the villain, Elena didn't have to be the protagonist of her own life. She could stay a spectator. I leaned in and said, Elena, you've spent 34 years blaming that woman for the air you breathe. And maybe she deserves some of that. But you're a grown woman now. You're sitting on this stage because you chose to be here. So stop telling me what she did to you and start telling me what you're doing to yourself. The audience went quiet. You could hear a pin drop. Elena looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see the mask or the victim. I saw a flicker of genuine terror. She knew I was closing in. She knew that the safe conversation was over. We were standing at the edge of the woods, and I was telling her it was time to go in. I've often said that you can't change what you don't acknowledge. Elena had spent her whole life acknowledging the wrong things. She was a master of the distractor conflict. She would pick fights about money, about schedules, about her mother's tone of voice, all to avoid the one truth that was coming her alive. I could see the sweat starting to bead on her forehead despite the cold studio. I knew we were close to a breakthrough, but I also knew that if I pushed too hard, too fast, she'd shut down and walk off that stage. I had to pace it. I had to build a bridge of trust so she would feel safe enough to set her burden down. I decided it was time to bring Diane out. I wanted to see the two of them in the same space, because you can tell more about a relationship in 5 minutes of observation than you can in 5 hours of testimony. When Diane walked onto the stage, she didn't look like the monster Elena had described. She was a petite woman, impeccably dressed, carrying herself with a rigid, almost military posture. She didn't look at Elena. She looked at me, gave a sharp nod, and sat down as if she were taking a seat at a board meeting. The atmosphere shifted instantly. It went from heavy to electric. Elena's entire body recoiled. She didn't move an inch, but you could see her internal walls slamming shut. Diane didn't waste any time. Before I could even get a word out, she started defending herself. She spoke about how much she had sacrificed for her daughter, how she had curated a life for Elena that most people would dream of. She used words like legacy, reputation, and standard. It was clear that to Diane, her daughter wasn't a person, she was a project, a reflection of Diane's own success or failure. I watched the two of them, and it was like watching two people speak different languages. Elena was talking about her feelings, her pain, and her resentment. Diane was talking about optics, achievements, and the family name. They weren't even in the same zip code, let alone the same conversation. I looked at Diane and said, "You're very focused on how things look, Diane, but I'm interested in how they feel. Do you have any idea how much your daughter is hurting right now?" Diane scoffed, a tiny, sharp sound. She said Elena was dramatic and that she had always been sensitive. It's a word people use when they want to dismiss someone's pain without having to deal with the cause of it. I turned back to Elena. She was shaking now, a fine tremor in her hands. The escalation was happening right in front of me. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was a lifetime of suppressed rage coming to a boil. The conflict moved toward the father's death. This was the catalyst. According to the notes, Elena's father, Robert, had passed away 6 months ago from what was officially called a sudden cardiac event. Since then, the family had been in a tailspin. Elena had stopped speaking to her mother, and Diane had threatened to cut Elena out of the substantial estate. But as they argued about the money and the lawyers, I realized that neither of them cared about the inheritance. The money was just the scoreboard. It was the way they were keeping track of who was winning the argument. I stopped them both. "Enough," I said, my voice cutting through the bickering like a knife. "We are not here to talk about bank accounts. We are here to talk about the man who isn't in this room." Robert: "Elena, you said your father was your hero. Diane, you said he was the rock of this family. But since he died, you two have been trying to destroy each other. Why? What did his death change that made it impossible for you to even sit in the same room without a mediator?" Diane looked away. Elena looked down at her lap. The silence was deafening. I could feel the secret humming in the air between them. It was a tangible thing. I've seen this before, families that are built on a foundation of lies. As long as the patriarch is alive, everyone maintains the fiction. But when that central pillar is removed, the whole structure starts to groan and crack. I looked at Elena. Her breathing was shallow. She was reaching a breaking point. I could see the internal struggle, the lifelong habit of protecting the family image versus the agonizing need to be free of the lie. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "Elena, you're holding on to something that's killing you. I can see it in your eyes. I can see it in the way you're bracing yourself. You didn't come here to argue about money. You came here because you can't carry this alone anymore. What happened in those final weeks? What is the thing you've never said out loud?" She looked up at me, and her eyes were filled with tears. Not the tears of a victim, but the tears of someone who is terrified of the truth they are about to tell. Diane sensed the shift. She tried to intervene, her voice sharp and commanding, telling Elena to be careful and remember who we are. It was a blatant attempt at silencing her, a hush delivered on national television, but the dam was already starting to break. Elena looked at her mother, then back at me. "He wasn't who everyone thought he was," she whispered. Her voice was so low, the microphones barely caught it. Diane stood up, her face flushed with anger, demanding that we stop filming. She was terrified. The legacy was under threat, but I didn't look at Diane. I kept my eyes locked on Elena. I told her that the truth doesn't need a lawyer and it doesn't need an audience, it just needs to be told. I told her that she wasn't responsible for her father's actions or her mother's image. She was only responsible for her own integrity. The confrontation was reaching its peak. Elena began to describe the months before her father died. He hadn't been sick with a heart condition, at least not at first. He had been unraveling. The rock of the family had been crumbling under the weight of his own secret life. Elena had discovered that her father had been involved in a series of financial improprieties, embezzlement from the very community that idolized him. But it was worse than that. She had found out that he had another family, a second life he had lived for nearly 20 years. The studio was dead silent. Diane had sat back down, her face a mask of cold, hard stone. She knew, she had known all along, that was the real revelation. The controlling behavior, the strictness, the obsession with image, it was all a desperate, frantic effort by Diane to keep her husband's double life from being exposed. She had enlisted Elena into this conspiracy of silence, forcing her daughter to help cover the tracks, to lie to the investigators, to keep the secret buried even after he was in the ground. Elena was sobbing now, the words pouring out of her like a flood. She talked about the night he died. It wasn't a peaceful passing in his sleep. He had died in a hotel room, and Elena and Diane had been the ones to find him. They hadn't called 911 immediately. They had spent 2 hours cleaning the scene, removing evidence of the woman who had been with him, making sure that when the paramedics arrived, it looked like a dignified tragedy. They had traded his soul for a headline that wouldn't embarrass them. I sat there, letting the weight of that confession settle on the room. This wasn't just a family secret, it was a psychological prison. Elena had been forced to become an accomplice in her own father's dishonor. She had been tasked with protecting a ghost at the expense of her own sanity. I looked at Diane, who was still sitting there, unmoving, refusing to acknowledge the horror of what she had asked her daughter to do. "You asked her to be a janitor for his sins, Diane," I said. I looked Diane square in the eye when I said those words. I wanted her to feel the weight of them. You asked her to be a janitor for his sins. The room was so still you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Diane didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just tightened her jaw, her eyes like 2 chips of cold flint. She told me I didn't understand. She said, "I wasn't there, that I didn't know what it was like to have an entire community looking up to you, to have a reputation that took 40 years to build." She said she did it to protect Elena. She actually believed that. In her mind, she was the hero of this story, the one who stayed in the trenches and kept the dirt off the family name. I've seen this kind of delusion before. It's a specialized form of narcissism where the image of the family becomes more important than the people in it. I told her, "Diane, you didn't protect her. You poisoned her. You took a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and you handed her a shovel and told her to start digging a hole for the truth. You made her an accessory after the fact to a life of lies. How do you think she sleeps at night knowing that every condolence she receives is based on a fiction she helped create?" Elena was slumped in her chair, her face buried in her hands. The sobbing had turned into a low, jagged kind of breathing. It was the sound of a person who had finally run out of air. I turned back to her, my voice softening. I needed her to understand the mechanics of what had happened to her. See, when you live a lie of that magnitude, it creates a split in your psyche. There's the person the world sees, the successful, composed Elena, and then there's the person who knows the truth. Those two people can't occupy the same space for long without one of them trying to kill the other. I asked Elena how this secret had affected her marriage. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. She admitted that she couldn't let her husband touch her. She couldn't look him in the eye. Every time he told her he was proud of her or how much he admired her family, she felt like she was a fraud. She was living in a beautiful house built on quicksand. She had become cold, distant, and erratic. Her husband thought she was grieving her father's death. He didn't realize she was actually grieving her own integrity. She was so terrified of the truth slipping out that she had pushed away the one person who could have helped her carry the weight. You're sabotaging your own life to protect a dead man's mistakes, I told her, and the irony is, he isn't even here to thank you for it. He's gone. But you're still standing guard at his grave, making sure no one sees the cracks in the headstone. I let that sink in for a moment. I wanted her to see the absurdity of the situation. We often think we're being loyal when we keep these kinds of secrets, but loyalty to a lie is just a slow-motion suicide. Diane interrupted then. She started talking about the greater good. She mentioned the charities Robert had supported, the jobs he had created, the people who relied on him. She argued that revealing the truth would destroy dozens of lives and do no one any good. It was the classic utilitarian defense for dishonesty. But I wasn't buying it. I told her that the greater good starts with the truth. You can't build a healthy community on a foundation of stolen money and double lives, and you certainly can't build a healthy daughter on a foundation of emotional blackmail. What is the cost of this secret, Diane? I asked. Look at your daughter. Really look at her. Is it worth her sanity? Is it worth her marriage? Is it worth the fact that she's sitting on this stage trembling because she can't bear the weight of your legacy for one more second? Diane finally looked at Elena. For a split second, I saw a flicker of something, maybe guilt, maybe just recognition cross her face, but then the wall went back up. She looked away and said, she should have been stronger. I carried it. Why couldn't she? That was the aha moment for me. That was the core of the problem. Diane viewed her own ability to compartmentalize and lie as a strength, and Elena's basic human need for honesty as a weakness. It was a complete inversion of reality. I've dealt with thousands of families, and I can tell you the people who carry secrets like that aren't strong. They're just numb. They've traded their ability to feel for the ability to perform. I turned my attention back to Elena. I needed to move her from the confrontation phase into the breakthrough phase. I told her, Elena, you've been waiting for your mother to give you permission to tell the truth. You've been waiting for her to say, I'm sorry I put this on you, you're free now. But I've got some news for you. She's never going to say that. She can't. To admit you're right would be to admit that her entire life has been a charade. She's too far gone into the lie to ever come back out. Elena's eyes widened. So what do I do? She asked. How do I live with it? You don't live with it, I said. You give it back. You decide right here, right now, that you are no longer the custodian of Robert's reputation. You are no longer the janitor of this family. If the truth comes out and the legacy crumbles, let it crumble. It wasn't yours to build, and it isn't yours to save. You have to choose between being a loyal daughter to a ghost or being a healthy woman for yourself and your husband. I could see the gears turning in her head. This was the moment of decision. I've seen people reach this point and turn back. The fear of the unknown, the fear of what happens when the secret is out, can be more paralyzing than the pain of the secret itself. They think, if I tell the truth, everything will change. And they're right, everything will change. But change isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes you have to burn the field to get a better crop next year. I stayed with her, keeping my voice low and steady. I told her about the law of the land in our studio. Here, the truth is the only currency that matters. I told her that by saying those things out loud today, she had already broken the spell. The secret didn't have power over her anymore because it was no longer a secret. It was just a fact. A ugly, complicated, messy fact, but a fact nonetheless. Elena took a deep breath. Her shoulders, which had been up around her ears for the last hour, finally dropped. She looked at her mother, really looked at her, and she didn't look angry anymore. She looked sad. She realized that Diane was just as much a victim of this system as she was. Diane was just a woman who had spent so long pretending that she didn't know how to do anything else. "I'm not doing it anymore, Mom," Elena said. Her voice was quiet, but it was the strongest I'd heard it all day. "I'm not lying to the lawyers. I'm not lying to my husband. And I'm not going to spend the rest of my life making sure Dad looks like a saint in the newspapers. He wasn't a saint. He was a man who hurt a lot of people, including us. And I'm done pretending otherwise." Diane didn't explode. She didn't yell. She just stood up, smoothed her skirt, and said, "Then you've made your choice." She walked off the stage without looking back. It was one of the coldest things I've ever seen in all my years doing this show. But for Elena, it was the ultimate confirmation. By walking away, Diane had released her. The cord was cut. I turned to the audience and then back to Elena. "You just did the hardest thing you'll ever have to do," I told her. "You chose yourself over a lie. Now the real work begins. We have to figure out how to rebuild your life on a foundation of truth. And that's not going to happen overnight. You've got a lot of unlearning to do. You've been trained to hide. Now you have to learn how to be seen." I could see the relief flooding through her. It wasn't a happy ending in the Hollywood sense. Her family was fractured. Her mother had essentially disowned her, and the fallout from her father's actions was still coming. But for the first time in years, Elena was breathing. She was present. She was finally, truly in the room. After Diane walked off that stage, the silence that followed was different than the one we started with. It wasn't the silence of a held breath. It was the silence of a building that had just collapsed. Elena sat there staring at the empty chair where her mother had been sitting for the last hour. You could see the realization washing over her, the realization that the woman who had raised her, the woman she had spent her entire life trying to please, was willing to trade her daughter for a polished headstone. It's a devastating thing to witness, but it's also the most honest moment Elena had ever experienced in that relationship. I sat there with her for a minute. I didn't say a word. Sometimes you just have to let the reality of a moment settle into a person's bones. If I had started talking right away, I would have been rescuing her from the pain, and she needed that pain. She needed to feel the sting of her mother's rejection, because that sting was the proof that she was finally telling the truth. You don't get rejected for a lie that serves the family. You only get rejected when you stop being a part of the machine. Finally, I leaned in and said, "She didn't just walk off a stage, Elena. She walked away from the responsibility of being your mother. And as painful as that is, I want you to look at how much lighter your posture is right now. You aren't looking at the curtain waiting for her to come back and fix it. You're looking at me. You're looking at the world as it actually is, not as you were told to pretend it was." We started talking about the specifics of that night in the hotel room. I wanted to drag it out into the light because secrets lose their power when you describe them in detail. She told me about the smell of the room, the cheap perfume of the woman who had fled, the clinical scent of the hotel soap, and the overwhelming metallic smell of her father's passing. She described how Diane had moved with a terrifying, robotic efficiency. Her mother hadn't cried. She hadn't even checked for a pulse at first. Her first instinct was to find his briefcase, his phone, and any personal items that shouldn't have been in a room like that. Elena had been 25 at the time, and she had stood by the door, frozen, while her mother staged the scene. They had moved him. They had literally moved a deceased man to make it look like he was resting comfortably, then waited for the right amount of time to pass before calling for help. Think about the psychological trauma of that. Think about what that does to a daughter's perception of her father, her mother, and herself. She was turned into a stagehand for a macabre play. I asked her about the other family. She told me she had found the bank records. Her father had been funneling money into a separate account for years, supporting a woman and 2 children in a town only 3 hours away. He had birthdays there. He had Christmas celebrations there. He had a whole nother legacy that Diane had been aware of and had chosen to ignore as long as it didn't cross the threshold of their front door. See, Elena, I said your mother wasn't protecting your father's honor. She was protecting her own status as the official wife. She was protecting her seat at the head of the table. She was willing to let you carry the trauma of that hotel room as long as she didn't have to face the humiliation of being the woman whose husband had a secret life. That's not love. That's a business arrangement. And you were just a junior partner who didn't get a vote. The audience was gripped. You could see people leaning forward, shaking their heads. This wasn't just a family secret anymore. It was a case study in how image obsession can turn a family into a cult of personality. I've seen it in corporate boardrooms, and I've seen it in small-town parsonages. When the image becomes the god of the house, the children are the ones who get sacrificed on the altar. I brought up the legal side of things. Elena's father hadn't just been a liar, he'd been a thief. He had been using his position in the community to run what was essentially a sophisticated shell game, moving money from local investments into his own private accounts to fund his double life. Elena knew the investigators were circling. She knew that the peaceful narrative was about to be shattered by a federal audit. That was the real reason for the inheritance dispute. Diane wanted to settle the estate quickly and hide the assets before the truth came out. She wanted Elena to sign papers that would have made her legally complicit in the cover-up. You realize that if you had signed those documents, you'd be looking at a prison cell right now, don't you, I asked. Elena nodded slowly. She hadn't even thought about the legal consequences until that moment. She had been so focused on the emotional betrayal that she hadn't realized she was being set up to be the fall guy for her father's crimes. This is what happens when you let image drive the bus. You lose your moral compass. You lose your sense of self-preservation. Elena had been so conditioned to protect the family name that she was willing to go to jail for a name that was already mud. I told her, you cannot be more loyal to a dead man's memory than you are to your own future. Your father didn't protect you when he was alive, and he certainly isn't protecting you now. You have to be the one to draw the line in the sand. We talked about her husband next. This was the part that really broke her heart. She loved him, but she felt like she had been lying to him every single day of their marriage. She felt like she was damaged goods. I stopped her right there. You aren't damaged, I said. You're burdened. There's a difference. Damaged implies something is wrong with your core. Burden just means you've been carrying something that doesn't belong to you. When you set the burden down, the core is still there, and it's still strong. I gave her a prescription for when she went home. I told her she had to sit her husband down and tell him everything. Not the sanitized version, not the we had some family issues version, but the hotel room version, the embezzlement version. The second family version, I told her that if he was the man she said he was, he wouldn't judge her. He would be angry, but he wouldn't be angry at her. He'd be angry for her. He'd be the ally she'd been missing her entire life. But what if he leaves? She asked. It's the question everyone asks when they're about to tell the truth. If he leaves because you chose to be an honest woman instead of a professional liar, then he wasn't the man you thought he was anyway, I replied. But I suspect he's going to be the first person in 34 years to actually give you a hug and tell you that you don't have to be perfect to be loved. And let me tell you, that hug is going to be worth more than every dime in that fraudulent estate. The session was far from over. We had to deal with the what now. The what now is the hardest part of the process. It's easy to have a breakthrough on a stage with cameras and a supportive audience. It's much harder to walk back into your real life where the phone is ringing, the lawyers are calling, and your mother is sending you venomous text about how you've ruined everything. I looked at the cameras and I spoke directly to the people at home who were living their own version of Elena's story. I told them that the secret is a cancer. It starts in one part of your life. Maybe it's your childhood or a mistake you made 10 years ago, and if you don't cut it out, it spreads. It gets into your marriage, it gets into your parenting, it gets into your health. Elena was already showing signs of physical stress, insomnia, migraines, digestive issues. Her body was trying to reject the lie, even while her mind was trying to hold on to it. The truth will set you free, I said, but first it's going to make you miserable. It's going to tear down the walls you've spent a lifetime building. But those walls weren't a home, Elena. They were a prison. And today, you just walked out the front door. As the cameras pulled back and the lights in the studio dimmed slightly for a commercial break, I didn't get up. I stayed right there with Elena. This is the part of the show the viewers don't always see, the quiet, raw moments where the adrenaline of the confession starts to wear off and the reality of the aftermath begins to settle in. Elena was shaking, her hands gripping the arms of the chair as if she were afraid she might float away if she let go. She looked at me, her eyes wide and searching. It's a look I've seen on people who have just survived a car wreck. They're checking their limbs, making sure they're still whole, surprised that the world hasn't stopped turning just because their own personal world has ended. I leaned in, making sure my voice was just for her. I told her that what she had just done, standing up to that kind of systemic, generational pressure, was one of the bravest things I had seen in a long time. See, it's one thing to tell a secret to a friend or a therapist. It's quite another to say it out loud when you know your mother is listening and the ghost of your father is looming over the conversation. I told her that the shaking she was feeling wasn't fear. It was her nervous system finally discharging 34 years of stored up tension. It was the sound of the cage door opening. But I also had to be the one to tell her that the road ahead was going to be rocky. I'm not in the business of blowing sunshine up people's skirts. I told her, Elena, you've just poked a hornet's nest. Your mother is already on the phone with lawyers. The community that idolized your father is going to be shocked. And some of them are going to be angry at you for being the one to pull the curtain back. They liked the illusion because it made them feel safe. People don't like it when you mess with their perfect stories. She nodded, and I could see her bracing herself. She wasn't the fragile girl from the beginning of the show anymore. She was a woman who had finally found her footing on solid ground, even if that ground was currently covered in rubble. We talked about the secret from the title of our show, the one she never planned to say out loud. It wasn't just the embezzlement or the second family. The deepest secret, the one that had been rotting her from the inside out, was her own complicity. She felt that because she had helped her mother clean that hotel room, she was just as guilty as her father was. She felt she had forfeited her right to a happy life. I had to walk her through the psychology of that. When you're under the thumb of a dominant, narcissistic parent like Diane, and you're in a state of shock after finding your father dead, your free will is essentially non-existent. You're in survival mode. You're doing what you've been trained to do since you were a toddler. Protect the image at all costs. You didn't choose to be a janitor that night, Elena, I said firmly. You were drafted into a war you didn't start. You were a victim of emotional kidnapping. So stop judging your 25-year-old self by the wisdom you have today. That girl was scared, she was traumatized, and she was being manipulated by a master. You need to forgive that girl so the woman sitting here can actually live. She started to cry again, but these weren't the jagged, panicked tears from before. These were the tears of a person who was finally letting go of a shame that wasn't hers to carry. It's a powerful thing to witness when someone realizes they aren't the villain in their own story. We spent the rest of the time talking about the re-entry process. I told her she needed to go home and get a circle of truth around her. That meant her husband, a good therapist, and maybe a legal team that wasn't tied to her father's estate. She needed people who had no stake in the legacy and only had a stake in her well-being. I warned her about the pullback. See, when you make a big change like this, the people around you, the ones who benefited from your silence, are going to try to pull you back into the old patterns. They'll use guilt, they'll use family loyalty, they'll even use your own memories against you. They'll say things like, "How could you do this to your father's memory?" Or think of what this will do to your mother's health. I told her to recognize those for what they are, tools of control. They aren't about love, they're about maintaining the status quo. When they start throwing that guilt at you, Elena, I want you to remember this moment, I said. I want you to remember how it felt to finally breathe. You don't owe anyone a lie, not your mother, not your community, and certainly not a man who lived a double life and left you to clean up the mess. The only person you owe anything to right now is the woman you're becoming. We ended the segment with a sense of cautious hope. Elena knew she had a long road ahead of her. She knew the legal fallout from her father's embezzlement was going to be a nightmare. She knew her relationship with her mother might never be repaired, and frankly, after seeing Diane's behavior, that might be the healthiest outcome. But for the first time in her life, Elena was the one in the driver's seat. She wasn't a passenger in her mother's vanity project or her father's deception. She was the one steering the bus. As we walked off the stage, I put an arm around her shoulder. I told her my team would be following up with her, providing her with the resources she needed to navigate the fallout. I don't just do a show and then say good luck and walk away. I stay invested because I know that the breakthrough is just the start of the journey. The real work happens when the lights go down and you have to go back to a house that feels different because you're different. I watched her walk toward the exit where her husband was waiting. He had been watching from a monitor in another room, and when he saw her, he didn't look at her with judgment. He looked at her with a kind of awe. He grabbed her and held her so tight it looked like he was trying to fuse them together. That was the outcome I was hoping for. Not a perfect family reunion, but a woman who was finally seen and loved for who she actually was, not for the mask she had been forced to wear. As for Diane, she was gone. She had left the building before the show was even over. She chose her pride over her daughter, and that's a choice she's going to have to live with for the rest of her life. It's a tragedy. But you can't help someone who would rather drown in a lie than be saved by the truth. You just can't. You have to let them go and focus on the ones who are willing to do the work. I walked back to my dressing room, feeling the weight of the day. People ask me all the time if it gets easier after all these years. The answer is no. It doesn't get easier because the stakes don't get lower. Every time someone sits in that chair and tells a secret they never planned to say out loud, they are putting their whole life on the line. And it's an honor to be there when they do it. It's an honor to help them realize that the truth doesn't just hurt, it heals. It's the only thing that actually does. I sat down and took a look at the monitors one last time. The stage was empty, the crew was packing up, and the secret was out in the world. It wasn't a secret anymore, it was just a part of a story about a woman who chose to be whole. And at the end of the day, that's why I do what I do. Because everyone deserves to live in the light, no matter how much dirt they have to dig through to get there.